welcome. All right. It's been such a great experience to have this Jewels in the Wasteland series with AFS founder, artistic director, and I think he's made some movies too, Rick Linklater, with us to do this and to choose the films, to introduce the films, to discuss the films. It really is a super special film school that we have going on here in Austin, that you kind of just have to live in Austin and like maybe be an AFS member or pay like $10 or whatever to participate in. That's a lot cheaper than regular film schools, or as we call them, lame film schools. We're really happy to have everybody. So the way this works, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure everybody knows, is that in a minute, Richard Linklater will come up, introduce this film, provide some cultural context, maybe some memories about seeing this film for the first time and the impact that it had. Then we'll watch this movie on 35 millimeter. And then afterwards, we'll resume the stage and have a little discussion with all of you about what we just saw. I'm going to bring up Rick in a minute, but first, this series would not have been possible without our friends at Mubi. You see their logo right there. There's all kinds of streaming services out there. Most of them don't have any movies made before like 2014, frankly. There's a Criterion service, and that's really good, but Mubi goes far beyond Criterion to give you all kinds of great stuff, and we think it's ace. Hundreds of people signed up for this movie giveaway to see if they could get a free, what is it, like a free membership for a year to Mubi? Okay, and we're gonna give 2 of these away. So this one feels frozen. I'm gonna pick this one out, yes. So Juan Garcia, you win. All right, you don't have to come up, we'll email you. And then, oh, is there a spider in there? Grant Morris, this is a good day to be one of these people. So you guys are going to get a free year of Mubi. Thank you, Gabe. And now you're going to get a free introduction to this film from the great, the wonderful Mr. Richard Linklater. Come on. And that's my rainwater.
Wow, it's just so thrilling to be watching this film with you guys. Lars will attest, I've been bugging him for 5 years since the conception of this film series to like, well, what John Sayles film to show, you know? I've been pushing for Baby It's You. Can't find a print anywhere, right? Still not a print, just because I do love that film. It's a great young woman's coming of age movie with Rosanna Arquette and Vincent Spano. And it's a great film. It was his 3rd film. But, you know, we couldn't get through the 80s and not really get into John Sayles. He's just one of the seminal filmmakers of the era. He had a great 80s. So much of the series is really about how the great auteurs of the 70s really struggled in the 80s. Hollywood, things were changing post Heaven's Gate. If you think of what Cimino, Francis Coppola, Scorsese, Hal Ashby, the 80s were very different. Not that they didn't get there weren't some great films made, obviously, at the biggest level, but it was a different landscape, different playing field. But in the American indie world, which was in ascent, you know, John Sayles, you know, other directors, the indie directors had a great decade. If you think of Sayles films from that decade, I can remember them all. I was there for every single one of them. SECAUCUS 7, and we're showing this because it's that first film. It's that film, kind of like the one we showed a couple nights ago, Chan is Missing, one of those films that just made me want to pick up a camera and do it. It's just, you know, very personal to him. It's a wonderful success story. We'll talk more about that. But his next film, Liana, Baby It's You, Brother from Another Planet, Mate Juan, which I'd love to see that again, but we showed it here about 2 years ago when he and his partner Maggie were here. So we'd shown that kind of recently in this very same theater. So one more reason to go back to the first one, SECAUCUS 7. And then he did 8 Man Out after that. So I think we take Sayles for granted. The more thinking of this screening and what he's meant to me, I just have to say, he is, I think, the link between kind of the indie spirit, you know, of the 70s, what that was, and he brought it into the 80s. He connects those 2 generations, even though, you know, to start with, Sayles is a writer. You know, he's like a writer. He wrote, before he was 30, he'd written 2 novels, National Book Award finalist for Union Dues, his other novels, Pride of the Bimbos. He wrote a great short story collection, Anarchist Convention. It won, you know, O. Henry Award prizes. So he's like a writer. But from college on, he said he really loved movies, and so he wanted to start, you know, making movies. So as a writer, he just started writing screenplays, and he's very gifted in that he really knows movies, he knows genres, and he could write pretty quickly. So he goes to Hollywood and has a great collaboration with Joe Dante. He writes Piranha and The Howling for Louis T. Woman in Red, Alligator. So he's doing kind of exploitation films, Corman level, Battle Beyond the Stars. But he's, you know, I wouldn't say building a name for himself as a future director. He's just a writer who's got some respect. And so this is the moment, this is what's different between the 2 generations, and I give Sayles 100% of the credit for kind of creating this new template for indie films. The way to the director's chair for everybody before that, and I'm talking, you know, Demi, Scorsese, Bogdanovich, Coppola, you know, just everyone coming through the system. You go to LA, you try to get an agent, you work for Corman, you write an exploitation film, you direct an exploitation film of some kind, and you work your way up to getting your films made. That's just kind of how they had done it from the 60s on. Sayles, you know, breaks the mold when he's been writing those exploitation films, wants to be a director, and instead of directing one of those exploitation films, you know, it would have made perfect sense for Corman to hire him as a director. But he doesn't do that. He puts his own money on the line, self-finances with his screenwriting money for 60 grand. He makes this movie. And it's not like that hadn't been done. There had been personal films made, obviously. I think Killer of Sheep comes before this. Even our own Eagle Pinnell's Whole Shooting Match is probably a year before this. John Cassavetes is out there. But those films really didn't have, and we talked about this last week with Shannon's Missing with John Pearson after. I kind of blanked for a second, like, yeah, how did people see movies before there was indie distribution? It's like, well, they saw them at film societies. A lot of campus screenings, sometimes museums. But from a filmmaker's, if you made this indie film, you couldn't expect anything. And the thing this film has in common with last week's film is both directors, if they will say, like, I made this film because I kind of had to, you know, but my expectations were no one would ever see it. I don't know how they would. You know, like maybe we'll play at a festival, maybe it'll be a part of a program, maybe I'll show it one night at a film society somewhere, maybe the word will get out. I mean, from a filmmaker's perspective, the economy of that was very limited. You maybe get your German TV, you might buy it for 20 grand or something, or 10 grand. You could kind of pay for it, but not really. It just, there wasn't a landscape for American indies of this nature. There were, if you think of what was available in the indie world, well, we all know what that is. It's exploitation films, it's sexploitation films, it's blaxploitation films, and it's foreign films. You know, that's what would play kind of off Hollywood, but there seriously wasn't a category for American independent films. There really wasn't in a theatrical setting. Cassavetes, you know, if Woman Under the Influence came out and got great reviews, you know, maybe he would get a team of young future distributors to work for nothing and get the film out there, and they'd create their own distribution company for that one film. It was a hustle, and it's really great when you hear these stories from the trenches. And Cassavetes himself kind of bred a lot of future distributors in that kind of renegade distribution, but it was not, there weren't companies, there wasn't really commodified. And the other indie films, of course, were midnighters. You know, throughout the 70s, you would watch, well, there were old kind of films, but the new ones, you know, say a John Waters film, Pink Flamingos would be playing at midnight. Eraserhead was a breakthrough film from '79, and you know, there was a little, but that's a midnighter. You know, mainstream America, that film wasn't showing at, you know, in a matinee or at 7:30 on a Friday. That went straight to midnight. All those films did. So again, there wasn't this niche, but SECAUCUS 7, he made it, I think, in '79, and it came out briefly in '80. supposedly didn't do well. They tried to show it for like a week in New York. It didn't do well. It played at some FilmX or something in LA. It won some prize. And then I think a company did pick it up. Someone took a bigger leap with it, put it out there, and it became an indie sensation. It's really, I think it's the first American indie film I ever saw. I was summer of '81. I was 20 years old. I was starting to go to a lot of movies, and I just had read a review. It seemed inspiring. I was certainly inspired by his story. This 30-year-old guy who, paid for his own film and his own background, and I'm like, cool, I'm going to see that film. But this film was truly an indie sensation, I think largely because of the freshness of it, the subject matter. And it'll be interesting for us to see this film that's pushing 40 years old now, just because, and to think back to this moment, it was really his generation. The film is about this group of friends getting back together. They're all turning 30. They were all college friends. They were arrested in Secaucus, New Jersey, heading toward a anti-war protest. So he's of that political generation, anti-Vietnam generation. And, the 70s goes on. They're turning 30. And so it's a contemplation of what that generation is becoming, what compromises. And it's pretty heavy with that generation. I always kind of rag on that generation or have fun with it. But, they had the burden of expectations, for themselves. My generation wasn't burdened with that. So they really had put it out there, and they're still recovering. This film sort of captures these 7 friends. Well, I'll correct it. There's 6 friends, and there's one guy who's the boyfriend of one of them. And they're like 2 are school teachers. They're all staying at their place up in New Hampshire. There's one local guy who's a mechanic, David Stratharian. Sales himself plays a guy who's, I think he's the only guy who has kids. I remember a nice little monologue about being a father. One woman, she works for a senator, writes a speechwriter, and her boyfriend, who's the Gordon Clapp, the guy who's visiting, he's sort of the outsider. So if you put yourself in the outsider's perspective, these people are really familiar with each other. They have all the stories, they really know each other. But, so you just have to hang out with these people and get what they're about. So, but I think it's a great portrait, very honest portrait, and I'm sure what Sales, his friends, what they were thinking at that time, like, wow, and it's kind of funny, it kind of captures that 70s Jimmy Carter era malaise, to use his word, or did he ever say that? I don't know, in that famous speech. But it does kind of, there's a certain kind of, for them, you want to kind of say, hey, it's going to get a lot worse. But don't tell them that. So anyway, let's enjoy this movie. Like I say, go back, see it for what it is. I'm really curious to see it after all these years. I saw it probably 3 times back in the day, and have always been curious about it. Just wonder how it's doing, this film. So I just want to say, it did mean a lot. It was a big hit. It obviously meant a lot to that generation who was coming of age, and it meant a lot to indie cinema. I mean, the word of mouth, this film made, I think, a couple $1 million back then, which is enormous. Sheer word of mouth, like, there's all these films, but go see this one film that's about these, for that generation, and I'd say everybody in their 20s to 40s were, this film really spoke to them, and it was a big word of mouth hit. It just was a bit of a indie, it was the original indie sensation, and I think it really changed the landscape, both for indie distribution and kind of for what a filmmaker's trajectory. You don't have to go to Hollywood and work for Roger Corman, as romantic as that is. You can kind of stay where you are, make your own film in your own backyard, and that's what people of my generation, he kind of, Sales sort of set a path here that I think everybody from then on really worked off. So the influence is huge, Look at this little humble homemade movie, but know that its impact was big. And I don't think people talk about it in that way, but I know, because from just as both an aspiring filmmaker and looking at the kind of distribution landscape that has emerged after this, its influence can't be denied. So But Lars and I have plenty to, we'll have plenty to talk about the indie film history, and let's just talk about this film too. So I'll shut up and we'll enjoy the film and talk after. And there will be a test. This is a film school, so.
Me too. Oh, sorry. So you hadn't seen that in a while, yeah? Your thoughts,
I
sir?
think the last time I saw it must have been like 80. I saw it like I think 3 times back then, but yeah, a long time. Consistently funny, really great script, well structured. I don't know, it was fun. It's like a reunion, going back and saying, it's funny to see what goes on. Like David Strathairn, that's his first movie. I think a lot of those guys, Sales, Strathairn, like they all went to like Williams College together, and then Maggie, the woman who played Katie, is his longtime partner. I think she's an excellent actor. She's in a lot of his movies. You see that company that got built up around that, and it's so low to the ground. It's so like of the earth. It's so working class, I guess, in a way. Even though they're kind of East Coast going to Cornell's, and but it's still, it has no pretension on that level. It's kind of cool. You notice how I didn't mention Big Chill the whole intro, with a little restraint on my part. But it obviously comes along a couple years later, and everyone say, well, that's the studio version of this. And I don't know if that's actually true. I think Lawrence Kasdan, I think he said he never saw this or didn't. It was just a similar idea. I guess it's not, on one hand, that original idea, and a bunch of people get back together, maybe, but he probably read about it or something. I mean, who knows? But and that movie, which I like, I haven't seen that in a long time too, but I remember really liking Big Chill. But it's just, the music is so different, and everything's so big. They're all so rich and, big house and successful. It's really more about, God, how did we get so, we've done so well. We're all these guys, they're teachers, and I just like the level it's pitched at. I guess I hadn't really thought about that. But that's very John Sayles. Even the woman who says she's making so much money, she's writing speeches for a senator, but she says, well, the few thousand she has, nerve gas. They were really walking it like they talk it. I like their idealism and but it seemed, I don't know, it's very, very sincere.
There's nothing schematic about this group of friends. It feels like a real group of friends.
Yeah.
Like nobody would make up a character like Ron and just say, well, one of these kind of guys. He feels like somebody that you really know,
And you don't know he was the star athlete until pretty 2/3 of the way in the movie. He doesn't wear that on his sleeve necessarily. You do notice in the basketball game, oh, he's pretty good. But it's not the lead trait of him. And even his explanation of like, take the card of Ron. That makes a lot of sense. That's a real sentiment. If I go to a big city, I'm just another grease monkey. So, they're all pretty so well drawn. I don't know. It's just, Sayles is a good writer. What can you say? And this is a first film. It's a little rough around the edges. The awkward close up. You can say he's kind of learned how to make a film, but he really knows movies, and I think it's I don't know. It's really cool. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Have you how many times have you seen this?
I've never seen this.
So
The
this
first
is your
time I ever
first
saw it.
screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I was always sort of expecting it to be like, these boomers. Oh my God.
Yeah.
But it's a great kind of movie about being 30.
Yeah.
Like that's like primarily what it's about. It's not. You don't like look at it and see this like, oh, the flow of history runs through these people. You see it as being like, no, this is kind of what it was like when I was 30.
Yeah, it's not. The political backdrop's different in some of the details, but it's like there's something kind of perennial about it, So those dynamics, that group thing. So I remember when I was watching this for the first time, I was like, God, they're so old, They're
Right.
Totally. I'm like, God, they're so young.
Totally.
30s, nothing.
Yeah, but it's so much different. You are young when you're 30, which is good news to anybody here is 30.
Yeah.
I hope you really know that you are so young, but you're also not a kid anymore. And
Yeah,
there's all these things that are weighing in on you.
That's a good story. It's a good phase. They've made their life decisions largely. They're kind of getting entrenched. And they say it in the movie. It's one thing to be, going around the country at 20, but at 35, or what JT's future is kind of starting to scarily look like. They're all a little worried about him, rightly so. I don't know, you think he's going to make it as a songwriter?
Yeah.
Free Wright, White, and 21. That was pretty good.
It's a pretty competitive world in
Yeah, I don't know if
1979,
nobody's gonna be kind to
1880.
him.
Yeah, who knows? But one thing about sales that sales brings that you get from a good novelist is that that novelist shows you things that you've never seen represented before. Maybe you've thought it, maybe you've observed it, but you've never seen it kind of placed into a context of a work of art before. And there are like several of those in these. Like, I don't know if I've ever seen in a movie people listening to someone vomit in the next room and trying to figure out who it is by the sound of them vomiting. And that feels so real and like so kind of newly represented.
Yeah, I really like just that scene where they're just, when Maura and JT are deciding to whether to sleep together or not. That's one take too, by the way.
Yeah.
You know, that's pretty cool. I mean, it's funny and feels realistic. I don't know.
Yeah,
It's not
this movie
hackney has so much, you know. I've heard some people say, "Oh, it's amateurs and acting," and I just don't agree. I think they're really good. I love the characters, all of them. You know, Maura's intense. You know, I like Jeff a lot. He's funny.
Mhm. The only scene that feels sort of actory is the argument in the bar. I think that begins to feel a little sort of actory.
Yeah, they were a little. Well, their energies are so different, but I guess that's what they're kind of arguing about. So
Yeah, that's true. I wonder if we have any contributions, questions, anything from our audience. It could just be an observation.
Yeah, doesn't have to be a
What do you
question.
think of that sound design during the basketball scene? I thought that was really cool how they used like drum beats and stuff.
There's a lot of, I kind of forgotten all that, you know, it doesn't, but a lot of inventive, you know, sequences, you know, when he's doing the patties and he's playing it like a song. The movie becomes like its own little beat track kind of thing. It's pretty cool. Yeah, and those little pangs on during the basketball game. Yeah, no, he's trying some really cool shit.
I read a contemporaneous review of the film where the reviewer said that that basketball scene is sort of his one sort of concession to cinema, and which I don't agree with, but like you can see that it is sort of self-consciously sort of cinematic in its way.
The way
you know?
it's cut. And
Yeah,
stuff.
but I think a lot of the movie is, you know, it's just
Yeah.
less obtrusive.
I guess so, but I don't know if that means he has something to prove or that's just the way he wants to kind of capture the energy or
Sure,
that.
sure.
You know, at the end when Jeff's with the axe, you know,
Mhm.
that's similar. The quicker cutting, it has a slightly different feel, but I just think it's appropriate
Mhm.
for that character at that point, you know, basketball game.
Yeah, this movie wouldn't be appropriate for like sweeping shots from above and ceiling zooms and stuff.
Yeah, if you think about it, it's amazing what it's not doing. You know, it's not giving you a lot of vistas. I mean, isn't that a pretty part of the country, New Hampshire? I don't know. But you don't, no over the mountains or
No beauty
it's just,
shots.
It's just right in there with the people. Yeah, it's never attempts to be
Mhm.
like pretty,
Mhm.
ever, not one shot.
Which anybody else making this movie would have had to do that.
Well,
know?
because you could so easily.
Yeah.
You know, they're out in the woods, but it's not. You just jump.
Swimming is really beautiful.
What's that?
The swimming.
Yeah, that's true. The whole swimming whole sequence is well. Oh, you like the male nudity?
It's 6,000 salad bowls. Who else has a question or a contribution? Right over here, yeah.
So I'm not a film theorist by any capacity.
Well,
but
then get out of here.
You failed.
I am an analyst of sorts. I'm a biochemist. I was just thinking, it's like, could this type of film more be leading towards the Seinfeldian or like the Mumblecoreian? Like I don't know which like direction this sort of film is leading to. Are either one of those valid, or am I just like? Because it seems to me just like common people hanging out.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a strain of American indie cinema is that, you know. But it's definitely not. I don't know. I don't think it's quite either of those. It's not Seinfeld, and it's too, in a way, perfectly structured and scripted, I think, to be what mumblecore or whatever. So, but you know, it's all everything's. But I would say everybody involved in those two things had probably seen this or maybe could reference it.
It's interesting because like before this, there was Cassavetes making films that sort of feel similar in nature, sort of like talking and people working things out through talking.
Yeah.
It really is sort of like in the same way that in music there's like the new Bob Dylan every few years, you know, that there is kind of like a starting with maybe starting before Cassavetes, but maybe starting with Cassavetes, there's kind of a new Cassavetes or a new Bob Dylan in film, indie film every
What's
few years.
considered realistic. So, well, maybe it is Seinfeldian, you know, in that they're finding a lot of humor in not big stuff, you know, so it's not, I don't know, it's not like big comedy, it's that level, but low budget.
Movie about nothing.
Yeah.
Right back here, I see your hand.
Yes, I saw the movie when it came out in 1980. I was 23 then. It was funny then. I'm 61 now. It's still really funny.
Still funny, yeah.
And I saw it at an independent theater called the New Art in West Los Angeles, where I'm from, and everybody just raved about it back then.
Yeah, it was
Word of mouth just carried it.
truly a sensation at the time. I was trying to make that clear, you know, in my intro. It was a big deal. It was something new, you know. It's like I said, I think it really changed distribution. You know, like before that, I remember. I mean, back then, if you had that indie film, I remember like the AFI, American Film Institute, would put together a series, and they might travel that around to the landmark theaters and show those. But it was really hard to get your film seen. You know, this kind of created, I think, in the mind of a filmmaker, you could say, hey, you know, if I get lucky, maybe a distributor would pick up the film and distribute it, and that's what they do, you know, like that's big time. Even there still wasn't a lot of money involved. You know, there was an outlet, and most importantly, there were theaters that realized they could make money showing this. And as John Pearson was saying Monday night when we were talking about Chan It's Missing, I guess I hadn't thought of it that much. He said the English language films like this really started to squeeze out the international subtitled films. Like it ends up being more profitable for them to pick up English language films. So you see much more, and that gave a boost to Australia and England, and you know, just English language worldwide. But I hadn't really thought of it like that was the thing that. But American indies really started to push out the international cinema, I guess, economically. I never thought of myself as a part of an invasive species, but kind of, if you look at it that way, the way Pearson talked about it, yeah, I guess it was.
We've kind of arrived back in that place again, weirdly enough, because now, being a part of the Art House Convergence, which is a lot of different art house theaters, when we discuss that, what I hear from them is that like there are fewer and fewer locations that are willing to play subtitled films at all.
Yeah, which is crazy, but I don't know. It's sad.
It's incredibly it's so awful that we've reached this place. We're playing a lot of subtitle films.
Yeah, this theater, which you're a member of.
No, that was not it's really, don't apply for that, because this is such like a basic art house theater thing, all right?
That should not be an applause line. that in itself is
really. Come on.
Well, but you need new generations of film goers. Like, you know, it's like, I remember seeing my first subtitled film was I'd go into French film, you know, it's like, wow, subtitle, okay, you gotta read those ones. You know, it's like, and then it's like, oh, that's kind of cool, you know? So.
I remember one time when I worked at Draft House, there was a movie called Let the Right One In, which is a great horror movie, and it's subtitled, it's from Denmark, right, or Sweden? Sweden. And I saw a couple walk out, and they come out, and the woman, there's a male-female couple, the woman says, wasn't it great? And he's like, you didn't tell me it was a reader. And a reader. I see a hand back here.
I know some of these low-budget indie films, they use friends, locals, like in some of the goals. Did he do that? I know there was some professional actors, but were they all professional actors?
Well, like I said, I think a lot of them went to college together, friends. It was a pretty close-knit group, but inevitably, I'm sure they were casting, a lot of the other parts. But I don't think he had a lot. I think he paid everybody like $80. I don't know if it was a day or a week, or I read something once, but didn't have a lot of money. So it's definitely not a union SAG kind of thing. So I think a lot of the actors probably had varying degrees of theater experience, and maybe they probably had all been in drama in college, and to whatever degrees were pursuing it. But I think for most of them, it was like all their first films. Like I was saying, Stratheri and Clive. If you look at their filmographies, it's their first films. So
You do a lot in the way of smoothing performances by rehearsing in advance, right? Like if you get friends together, there's time to rehearse. And
you see these big. It's like one take, a big scene. They're all sitting there, and they're like, "Yeah, they got to work out the timing of that. That's not just showing up and hitting your mark and saying your line. They clearly had a camaraderie and a shorthand with each other, and I think it's pretty impressive. It's kind of a hard thing to do.
it can be a benefit of over and above just like having people who do have acting experience. If you just have friends, and those people have time to spend together to sort of work that out, maybe that it all kind of evens out a little bit acting wise.
Yeah, and when you know actors, if they've all known each other 10 years, so many of them, he can kind of write to their voices, their strengths, and what he feels they can and can't do. And I like Sayles gives himself kind of the dumbest, I don't know, who's dumber, him or Ron, I don't know, between, what's his name? But it's kind of funny he's playing that. Oh, that kind of.
If you don't know what he looks like,
hard,
Sayles is the tall guy he's playing basketball. He's got the kids.
He's got the multiple
yeah,
jobs.
yeah.
He's the kind of I gotta go back to work.
Yeah,
That guy. He might be thinking, oh, parallel life. If I had, if Maggie and I had kids, but.
Does he have as much of a part as he had in this in any other films? I remember.
Of John Sayles?
Appeared in Brother from Another Planet.
Yeah, he shows up in all of them. He plays Ring Lardner in 8 Men Out. He gives himself a pretty good part. I think Sayles is a good actor. He shows up in a lot of films. He's in The Howling. These films he writes, he usually, I think, if you hang out with him, you're like, hey, John, come play a scene. I gotta, he shows up as a cop in one of the Demi films. He's a...
Something Wild.
Something Wild. He's a cop. I think he's just, you throw him in your movie. Actually, my favorite John Sayles performance is in a super indie film from, God, it must have been early 90s, called My Life is in Turnaround. Has anyone here seen it? Yes, do you know the scene I'm talking about? He's playing like a Hollywood producer. It's these two wannabe filmmaker guys who work in a bar and they're trying to make a film. And they're trying to raise some money, and he's like has some Hollywood connection, and he's sitting there and they're pitching him the film, and his scene is brilliant because he's playing like a Hollywood, like probably the person he probably hates the most in the world, he goes on this once he realizes, oh no, it's not going to be one of those, and he just rants about one of those films, it's hilarious. He's really.
Hopefully that clip is on YouTube.
Sayles he's really hardcore. He's a super nice guy, but he is, Baby It's You it's a great film, but it just got crap distribution. It got really dumped at the time. Apparently he pissed people off. Like it was a young Jeffrey Katzenberg. John Sloss told me this story, and they have the test screening. And John's like, well, that's the movie. He's kind of like that. It's like, I edited it. Nah, I don't want to cut it anymore. That's it. He's like, yeah. And they're, test screening. Well, it could, be a little shorter. All the political game you have to play. And then finally, Katzenberg looks to him and says, "Are you telling me, no one could say anything to, make an improvement or anything, help, this movie? You won't listen to anyone?" Goes, No, just not you. Yeah, I'm not saying no one, but not you. And that, like, okay, it's
He also, but he does play both sides of the street too, because he makes his films, but then he also does when he was here a few years ago, he mentioned some of the punch-up work that he was doing on like big studio films, and
Oh,
I'm not going
yeah.
to name what they are, but like
No.
big studio films.
Because of his abilities. I mean, he really knows film history. He knows what works in a film. He has this great ability. So he would make a good living. I mean, the sweet spot, if you're a writer, screenwriter, is the rewrite money.
Yeah.
You get paid like on a big ass Hollywood film, because they're usually kind of desperate by the time they, like, oh, we're either in production already or we're about to, and we need someone to punch up the script or have it make sense, or whatever they're desperate for.
And really true.
Yeah, and here comes the $100,000 a week, to sit there on your top. And sales, I talked to a producer I worked with. I think he did a rewrite. He did that on like the Mummy movies,
Mhm,
and they
mhm.
said it's incredible. Like, you get off the phone with him, you give him the notes, and then 5 minutes later, and this is like the fax machine, the pages are coming out. Like, he can just pow, pow, pow. So he has this gift that so he made his living doing that. And Apollo, 13. I mean, so many big movies. He wrote it. He wrote the first draft or an early draft of E.T. It was called Night Skies then for Spielberg. Who knows if you could get your hand on the script and see what from that. He wrote a draft of The Alamo, not the final film, but apparently I knew some actors who really were rallying around that script and couldn't wait to make it, so. But that's not the script. So, he's had a big career as a writer.
It's almost like he's doing this sort of spiritual money laundering, where he's like taking money from like big Hollywood and transmuting it into his own films.
Well, I think Cassavetes was a good example. He's not a writer. Cassavetes would take his acting money when he had to and, put it into his films. He would self-finance the films when he had to. And that worked for him. So I think you could look at it that way and separate those two things pretty easily. You do that to finance that. So I think it gave him a certain freedom to not really have to compromise at all, ever. So there's no one with kind of more consistency and integrity in that way, I think. So.
Yeah, it's true. I wonder if we have maybe last couple of contributions from our audience here. I see a hand right over here.
I was gonna say, that's my first time seeing this, but I've liked a lot of his later films. But to see the editing he did in this film, I think there is that rhythm, because the dialogue has a natural rhythm. Then you have the scene at the bar specifically, where he keeps coming back to her getting a gin and tonic, or getting his different drinks, and it has this great like little vignette scenes, and then back to her, and it just keeps it rolling. I thought that was kind of what really set this film apart for me.
Yeah, and those little short dissolves, and it's.
And speaking of that, I love that she ordered a Michelob instead of like
Michelob.
instead of like a beer, or it was a specific beer. I like
In that part of New Hampshire, a Michelob was probably like the fancy beer.
Yeah. Well, remember in River's Edge, it was like, you could have at least got a Michelob.
Right.
I think the 80s were a Michelob
okay.
decade, for sure. Michelob was pretty, doing pretty well at that point.
I saw another hand right over here.
The film is so meandering, like people trickle in and trickle out, and I'm just kind of glad that they didn't cash in on Chekhov's heroin in the movie. It just feels like a different movie would have like closed that thread, but it was just sort of
That they leave he has that little heroin, they leave it.
yeah.
Or the fact that he has it on him when they're in custody.
Yeah.
That's kind of.
Yeah, I guess that is the closing of the thread there.
Yeah. But what happens with the heroin?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I love when movies have these like little perverse things where like a thing is planted that never pays off.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool actually, because like you go back and you're like, wait a minute, and it's like almost like that character's living on until that thing pays off some point down the line.
Yeah, where it's so satisfying in cinematic storytelling to have the payoff. Like it's just geared toward that. Some people are so good at it. But yeah, I'm with you. I like because that's kind of how life is. If you're trying to be natural, thoughts are incomplete, conversations aren't complete. Things don't tie up in a bow. But if you can still get some satisfaction structurally. Because that's what we get. It's kind of, they don't make a big deal of it, but how long are we with them? How many nights? Is it just 2
3 or 4 days maybe? I don't know.
It's not that long. I want to say it's like 1 weekend, I guess.
Yeah.
couple nights.
Yeah. So this is the next to the last one of these, which for this time. Although I hope we'll do another one soon.
We've come up with the title for the series, the never-ending
right
film series, like Dylan's tour. It's now established.
But next week we go into one of the ones that we first talked about when we were even discussing the idea of doing this series, which is Alan Rudolph's Choose Me.
Similar to Sales, you know, you have to think Rudolph was another director, had a great 80s while these other people were struggling. He really just turned out one really interesting film after another. He's kind of a West Coast, he's closer to the industry in a way, but these companies that, you know, like they weren't like studio films, they weren't $60,000 films, they were that probably, I don't know, somewhere around $1 million or, you know, whatever. He would have stars, they're a little more polished, but they've got a really indie, his own sensibility, their own unique vibe to them. And, you know, he's just, you know, a really wonderful director. And I think, yeah, I was like, well, which Alan Rudolph? We got to show an Alan Rudolph film. So I picked Choose Me, because I remember at that time that was kind of a big deal, but it really could have been any number of ones. But, you know, that was you know, the companies that kind of came together. We were talking before about, you know, I think the film studies we were talking about, those campus film screenings that would show films, the indie films, those guys all grew up and kind of started companies like Cinecom and Avenue, the ones that did distribute the films of the Sony, it was Orion Classics, the Classics divisions, and, you know, that's what grows out of, you know, at this era on. So by the time, I don't know who distributes Choose Me, but is it one of those kind of,
I don't know
Cinecom,
what distributed
you know,
it.
somewhere.
It was like a studio adjunct kind of, like
Yeah.
it wasn't like a tiny company like the
They-
company that distributed this.
And they just referred to them all as specialty films.
Yeah.
You know, they weren't indie films. It was just specialty releases, which just meant they weren't, you know, 1,000 print releases, but they were, you know, 20 to 50, and they might play in all those kind of theaters. Every town had one theater that it would play at, but, you know, it became a business. So Rudolph, like Sales and like a number of others, caught a great wave, you know.
In Rudolph's case, I think he was able to get really polished, really good actors who
Yeah.
wanted to make good work, who might be able to work in Hollywood too, but who
Sure.
he could get for scale or whatever in order to make his projects because they were quality.
Yeah, because he's a Robert Altman.
Mhm.
He was Altman's assistant director, Robert Altman protege. So he gets a lot of Altman actors. You know, Keith Carradine's in almost every movie. You know, so many of his, and he's big in next week's film. And yeah, he built his own stable of actors, and you know, they're just always intriguing little off-kilter movies that are, you know, I don't know. I'll be curious to see it again. I have no see how that holds up, but it's definitely worth seeing. Nice sensibility, and you know, Keith Carradine, I think, is just wonderful.
It's just great. Yeah, the great 80s too.
Yeah, definitely. So
Well, the good
that's a
news
week
is
from tonight.
You will be seeing it a week from tonight. Yes, they sent a
Please
print
come
that
back.
had duplicate reels, but we're getting that fixed up, and that'll be, we hope, here by next
Good thing
week.
you got to test for that, you know.
You gotta
That's where
pick
we're
a
better
friend, like
than the
Nick Quintana did.
grindhouse. You would
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
have to watch both those reels.
Yeah.
And then go, hey, what happened? See, we're more thorough around here. We try to.
And let me just take a moment to thank our projectionist, which I should do every single show, Nick Quintana.
we take a
Thank you.
minute.
And let me thank all of you for
Yeah.
coming. We really appreciate it, and thank you so
Yeah.
much, Rick, for coming and doing this with us.
See you next week.
All right.